Is that the growing interest in the variationist aspects of cognition and of grammar in general is paralleled by a methodological shift. Grammar studies are shifting towards methods that are perhaps already more entrenched in sociolinguistics. And there are two aspects to that. On the one hand, there is, of course, the major movement towards corpus studies. So people start doing quantified corpus-based analysis with statistical testing of hypotheses as an important perspective. And on the other hand, there's also this tendency towards multifactorial analysis, where what you do is, when you describe linguistic phenomena, you include both the language internal aspects, of the syntactic, semantic, and so on nature, and language external ones, the ones that you would traditionally confine to sociolinguistics. They're now being combined with the language internal thing that would traditionally be confined to grammar studies. So this combination, I'm going to skip this. This combination suggests a model of language that is fundamentally different from what we had in the late 20th century. On the one hand, if you think of the importance of corpus-based analysis, that contrasts with the originally structuralist idea that language is a lecturally homogeneous system. I'll explain that in a moment. And multifactoriality contrasts with the Chomskyan, the generative idea, that the grammar is a modular system. So let's explain this. What is the traditional view of the homogeneity of language systems? Traditionally, and this is something that I think is very much entrenched in linguistic thinking, we think of languages, even if they're dialects or whatever, but we think of languages as a system that is the same for all members of a community. That's how we define dialects or language varieties and languages. Accordingly, each member of a community is a representative sample of the behavior of the community. If everybody shares the everybody in a given community shares the linguistic system, then in statistical terms or in methodological terms, each member of the community is a representative member, a representative sample. Everybody has full knowledge of the system. And that is a motivation for an introspective approach. An introspective approach as was used by generative grammar. On the other hand, if you don't believe that everybody has the same knowledge of the language, whatever the language is, then obviously introspection will not be sufficient, and you will have to do some more empirical work, descriptive work. So to motivate or to put it differently, there is a link, a theoretical, conceptual link, between the choice of a certain methodology and the assumptions that you have about homogeneity of linguistic systems. So it might be quite important to have a closer look at what linguistic systems are, how homogeneous they actually are, because that correlates with the method that people are using. And in the same way, okay, this is what I explained. In the same way, if you think about modularity, then the idea there is that, for instance, you can do only syntax, because syntax is a system in its own. It's a component of the grammar that is autonomous. That's also the term that people use, right? autonomous syntax. The background here is, and I want to say a bit more about this, that the mind is compartmentalized in discrete components. That's the original idea of modularity. That's not yet linguistic modularity, but we need to say something about this to explain what's going on with linguistic modularity. So the mind is compartmentalized in discrete, different components, and then people think of things like vision and the other senses and language and moral judgment and a theory of mind and so on, next to some central processing unit. And an argument for this type of modularity is called the double dissociation argument, where people say, listen, if you look at people, then you can see that, for instance, language and intelligence do not necessarily correlate because you have them in all possible combinations. You have people with Down syndrome, they're not good at language and their intelligence stays at a limited level. People with aphasia can be very intelligent, but their language skills are low. Then, on the other hand, linguistic savants have incredible language skills, but they're not so specifically intelligent. And then other people, like the people in this audience, are both intelligent and have excellent language skills. So there is what is called a double dissociation. And this type of modularity then also implies that the modules are what is called informationally encapsulated. That is to say, each of those modules has its own principles of operation, its own essence, if you wish, or its own rules. It's, for the rest of the argument, it's important to see that the independent operation of the module-specific principles does not mean that the modules do not communicate with each other. The module, so non-communication, that's what I refer to here with the term opaqueness. It is the case in this model of modularity that the output of one module can be the input of another. So, for instance, sensory information can obviously be the input for conceptual categorization. But the idea is seeing is one thing and thinking is another. But the output of what you see might be input for thinking. So modules can have knowledge of each other, but their specific working principles are not affected. And then this idea of modularity is then applied to the grammar, and specifically to the components of the grammar. And then the idea is that grammars consist of discrete modules like syntax, semantics, pragmatics, and so on. And again, they operate independently, but input-output relations are not excluded. And again, just like what we had a moment ago with the homogeneity of language, there is a link with the methods that people are applying now in, let's say, corpus-based, usage-based variation studies. Because if you start from a modular point of view, then you want to keep your different modules separate. Then you will be doing either syntax or semantics, and you might wonder, which is one of those typical phrases that people sometimes use, what is the specific interface between syntax and semantics? That's precisely the input-output problem. That's the traditional model. But on the other hand, you might well also say, why not just bring them all together in one multifactorial model? And that's the tendency that you see nowadays in usage-based linguistics. So again, the question here is that a legitimate approach if you look at the results of what you do in such a multifactorial usage-based approach? approach? Do the results support the theoretical assumptions, the theoretical assumption of non-modularity and the theoretical assumption of non-homogeneity? That's the question. Am I clear on the questions? Because they're fairly theoretical. So, okay, so let's now see how we might argue against modularity. And I'll do that on the basis of a case study we once did on Dutch causative. That's already a few years ago, but in the meantime, the study itself has been refined in a number of ways. But for the argument I'm trying to make, this will be sufficient. So I'll first look at the types of arguments against modularity, grammatical modularity. Then briefly say something about the case study and how it supports one of the arguments. And then I'll consider a possible counter-argument. So let's first have a look at this idea of double dissociation. We saw how it worked with aphasia, or with intelligence and language. So how would it work with components of the linguistic system? Well, let's take an example. Let's take phonetics and pragmatics. Can we find double dissociation between phonetics and pragmatics? Yes, you might say, yes, of course, that's easy. For instance, linking vowels have a phonetic function, but they don't have a specific pragmatic function. Geeraertsian rules, they're not phonetic, but they're obviously pragmatic. Discourse particles have, of course, they have a phonetic form and they have a pragmatic function. And argument structure is something that we think of as neither phonetic nor pragmatic. Okay? You agree? So this would be an argument, a double dissociation argument for modularity. However, I think that you cannot use this argument. I think it's wrong to use it. Why? Well, you have to ask the question, what is the relevant entity with regard to which the double dissociation argument needs to be applied? So if you take the analogy, if you have a closer look at the analogy, we started with intelligence and language, and we looked at people who are intelligent but have low language skills and so on. So the question would be, what is the relevant counterpart of people in terms of the modularity of mind when you look at the modularity of grammar? Well, I don't think that you can just have a look at types or things like what we had a moment ago, Geeraertsian rules, as the relevant entity with regard to which double dissociation would have to occur. The real important entity, specifically from a usage-based approach, would be utterances. So the question would be whether we have utterances, linguistic utterances, that have no pragmatic level at all, and that have no phonetic level at all. And that's much more difficult to prove. So my argument here would be the double dissociation argument really does not hold if you take into account the question that the instantiation of the possibly dissociated elements actually happens at the level of utterances. So I'm not convinced by the double dissociation argument. Okay. Then the second option, the second aspect of modularity is informational encapsulation. So there the question is, if we perform a multifactorial analysis where we bring in factors belonging to different modules, where we would look, for instance, at the simultaneous effect of semantic and syntactic and maybe also language external features. Do the factors or the factor groups work independently or not? Now, it's important to see, precisely because of this input-output relation that you can have, that a significant effect of various factors alone. By the way, if you want to have a better idea of where we're going here, and that's going to be the example. So think of a multifactorial analysis in the form of a regression analysis, for instance, which is very common in use-based approaches. Well, a significant effect of various factors alone is not enough to prove the point, because that could merely indicate the non-opaqueness of the modules, like we talked about. So I think what we need to have a look at is a situation in which the various types of factors work together in a non-compositional way, where the joint effect of the factors goes beyond just adding them. Okay. And that is, of course, something that you can easily do in, for instance, a regression analysis, because that is what is actually captured by interaction effects in regression analysis. So regression analysis is one of the most widely used multifactorial analysis, and in regression analysis, non-compositionality effects show up in the form of interactions, combinations of variables that have an effect over and above the effect of the combined variables separately. Are you sufficiently familiar with regression analysis? Yeah? I could, just in case it should not be the case, the non-compositionality of interaction effects in a regression analysis, you can think of it more or less in the same way in which you think about non-compositionality in morphology. When the meaning of the two constitutive elements of, for instance, a compound is not enough to explain the total meaning of the morphological compound, then you have a non-compositional effect. And something similar happens, you could say, in the side of statistical analysis. So to simply show, if you're familiar with the type of work that's being done in usage-based analysis, you will probably be able to identify examples yourself. You will have illustrations in mind of multifactorial analyses with interaction effects. But let me just give one brief example. So this study on causatives in Dutch, where we looked at the presence of the choice between two auxiliaries, causal auxiliaries we have in Dutch, doen and laten. It's corpus-based, it's based on the corpus of spoken Dutch. Okay, I don't think it's so important to specify what the features of the corpus are. So the response variable is the presence of doen or laten. And we included specifically also external variables that have to do with the social structure of the corpus. So speaker characteristics, gender, age, educational level, there's regional variation between the two national varieties of Dutch, there's register variation because we have 15 components. There's dialogues, multilogues, monologues, private speech, public speech, and spontaneous versus prepared speech. And then we have the traditional structural variables, the language internal variables, the syntactic construction type, the co-referentiality between the matrix subject and the infinitival subject that's introduced by the auxiliary, subject-object, animacy of the matrix subject, the collocational, and two types of collocational strength between the auxiliary and the verb. But I'm not going to explain the difference between the two types of collocational strength. That's not so important for the example. So these are the various syntactic constructions that play a role. And these are the results. Yeah.
Can I just ask a short question?
Absolutely.
Could you start with your hypothesis? Did you have any hypothesis before you started your analysis? Maybe just a hint. What kind of difference you expected?
There was a very clear hypothesis that we started from, which was and that if I were to do this in more detail, I would explain how the choice for the variables was suggested by the hypothesis. Now, the hypothesis was something that Arie Verhagen and Suzanne Kemmer suggested in their analysis of causation, namely that there's a distinction between what they called direct causation and indirect causation. And that would have something to do with, in cognitive linguistics terms, with the causal flow of the energy, if you wish, the causal chain. And what we tried to do was to translate that hypothesis in more structural terms than what Verhagen and Kemmer did. And in their approach, Doon would be what they call direct causation, and Latin would be indirect causation. Only what we found is that when we tried to operationalize the hypothesis, it was not so entirely clear what precisely direct and indirect would be. And then ultimately the results, but that's not part of this talk. The results to some extent contradicted the initial hypothesis. Okay, but the point here is that so these first columns, that's the model without interaction effects, and these columns, that's the model with interaction effect, and then the highlighted rows are the significant interactions, and then of course you see that you do have interaction between elements that would normally be considered separate modules, like in this case. Okay, this is something that you might get away with. This is an interaction between animacy of the subject as a semantic factor, but then a register effect, spontaneous speech. And that's something where people might say, oh yes, but that's an external and an internal feature, so maybe that has something to do with, maybe you have maybe you need different grammars for the different types of speech.
There's different distribution of animating.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
words.
But in the theoretical model, you might say, okay, this is not something that you can use against modularity, because this only shows that you have a different grammar for the spontaneous register and for the other register. So this type of interaction basically refers to the second question that we have to deal with, the homogeneity question. The other, sorry, an interaction like this one, where you have the first one you do there, that's an interaction between a more syntagmatic effect, collocational strength, and let me see, and the semantic effect. No, in this case, the construction type and then the semantic collocational effect. I have to be precise there. So that's an interaction between things, syntax and semantics, that you would normally keep separate. So if you agree that interaction effects point to non-modularity, then this would be an example of the type of results that is relevant. Okay? So that's the crucial point. If we argue against non-modularity, against modularity in this type of studies, then we need to be precise about the type of phenomenon that actually shows non-modularity. And it cannot just be the simultaneous relevance, significance of various features. No, it would have to be the interaction of the various features in the statistical sense of interaction. Because then it's not just cumulative, if you wish. Now there is, so we find interactions between different types of variables. Yeah, I think this should be clear enough, so let me skip that. Briefly, something about a counter-argument. What if someone would say, yes, but the interaction patterns that you see, that's basically the end result of some type of sequential thing where you have the output of the syntactic module, for instance, and then that becomes the input of the semantic module, and then the syntactic features are changed. Okay? So a sequential model with an input-output chain might possibly also lead to the same result and still maintain modularity. How could you argue against that? Well, of course, you would need to see what the chain looks like. So if someone wants to defend this, then they should build a model that shows the same results. But I think that we might possibly try to model such an approach if we build a conditional inference tree for the results that we have here, and then see how the different types of features are present in the tree. So in this case, it's a very simple one. This is for at least the major part of the results, conditional inference tree, and what is important here, let me put it here, take this slide, is that semantic variables, specifically co-referentiality and animacy, are active at different stages of the decision procedure. So there is no pure sequentiality of the modules. If it's a question of first the syntax and then the semantics, then that would imply that once you've gone through the syntax, you cannot go back again. But if you see how it works in a conditional inference tree, if we can accept that this is an approximation of what a sequential model would look like, then you can see that semantic factors like inanimacy on top and then co-referentiality precisely at the bottom appear in different steps of the procedure. So if the modules, and notice that in such a model, in a modular model, you could not say co-referentiality and inanimacy are different modules. If you go that way, then any feature could be a different module, so that's not what you want. So co-referentiality and inanimacy would have to work on the same level, and they don't. So I think that first major step, if we want to argue against modularity, then the and if we agree that interaction effects and so on are an indication of non-modularity, then that is precisely what we find. Okay. Then, the other feature, lectal homogeneity, we already saw, and perhaps this is something that you will believe without further explanation. Perhaps you will say, you don't have to talk about this. We all believe that language is variable. Yeah, okay. but how variable? You do believe that languages are variable, but you probably also believe in dialects, in the existence of dialects. Don't you? Or varieties of a language. So in a sense, the question I'm asking here, how bad is it actually? How well? And so another question here is, or another way of asking the question is basically how well defined are the language varieties, the lects as I tend to call them, if you start from a usage-based approach. And so the question is, or the theoretical starting point is, just to come back to the beginning, why are we doing this? Well, because we're dealing here with methodological questions. Can we be multifactorial? Yes, because there's non-modularity. Do we really need empirical research or empirical methods? Yes, of course we do, but specifically also because the whole situation is thoroughly variational. That's what we should see now. But when do language varieties exist? How do we define a variety of a language as a more or less, in the more or less in the structuralist sense, as a system on its own? Well, lects as systems exist if linguistic variables occur in clearly identifiable bundles. It's like dialect features occurring in geographically determining sets. That's so we have systems, and that's, I think that's something that we tend to forget in linguistics. The notion of linguistic system clearly presupposes that there is an external factor determining the system, namely a community that uses that system consistently and coherently. So what's the method to use? The format is changing a little bit because I'm now inserting parts of separated. What methods can be used to establish heterogeneity? Okay, so let's ask the specialists. These people are real specialists of variation research, and you will know them from your history of linguistics, but let me briefly get back to the 19th century issue. What they did, of course, was, these are the people who looked at the language variation in the so-called Rhenish fan. Are you more or less familiar with that? No, okay. The question there is what, if you have the neo-grammarian hypothesis, and that's something that you know very well, then you presuppose a distinction between High German and then Low German and Dutch on the other hand. And that's the second Germanic sound shift, which gives you High German. Now, of course, if you look at it from a neo-grammarian point of view, then you will say, okay, High German, that's one clear system, and then Low German and Dutch, that's another system. And the sound laws will clearly distinguish between both. However, if you look geographically at the border area, so that's the Rhine area, and that's why they talk about the Rhenish fan. If you look at the Rhine area, then you can see that and you look at the isoglosses for each of the aspects of the Germanic sound shift, then you see that the isoglosses do not come in bundles. Okay, they form a fan in this way. Well, yeah, these are the phenomena that are involved. So you get this, the blue ones, that's High German, and the other ones, that's Low German and Dutch. And so you have the shifts in these are the standard instantiations that people look at. There are actually more, but this is the basic thing. So we have in principle, we have 6 isoglosses, and if you take the map, or if you take not isoglosses, well, you have a number of isoglosses, but the numbers are areas, right? So different areas where you would have no change, that's one, and a full change, that's 6, and then you have intermediate cases. And actually, geographically speaking, so this is the Romance area, that's the Germanic Romance borderline. Then you have a number of rivers here, Rhine and Mosel. But then you have the isoglosses, okay, from east to west. And the isoglosses do not co-occur. So for instance, this is the one distinguishing Appel and Apfel. This is the one distinguishing dat and das, and so on. Isoglosses do not co-occur, they form a fan, a visual metaphor. And that, of course, is a reasoning in terms of which you can say there is heterogeneity, the homogeneity that we assumed between, or that they assumed, between High German, the High German language area, and the Low German and Dutch language area actually does not exist in a very neat way. There is heterogeneity specifically in this transitional area. So why am I telling you? Oh yeah, this is just highlighting the isoglosses. Should have done that before. Okay. Now we can basically apply the same type of reasoning to the kind of usage-based studies that we do these days. Only, of course, and that's a complication. I'll explain this in a moment. This is just a graphical representation. But what we're doing these days is to deal with variational complexity, possible variational complexity of a much more advanced type than what we do when we only look at geographical factors. So in a sense, methodologically speaking, the question would be, what would be how can we translate the idea of a bundle of isoglosses into contemporary types of research? In principle, you can, in a sense, imagine isoglosses separate and sociolects and so on, but even then, the total structure of variation that you have could be quite complicated. So I'm coming to that in a moment, but here the idea is that this is just a way of trying to graphically represent usage-based models of language, where you have different speakers, and the different speakers have characteristics. Some have a specific color and others have another color, and some are wearing a certain type of clothes and others are naked, I don't know, they're wearing another type of clothes. So you have speaker characteristics, and they form groups on the basis of the speaker characteristics. They each use language and have an internal system. And then there might be a group commonality in the system. That's on top. And then, of course, the horizontal lines indicate how they influence each other. And then, of course, we have lects. We have clear lects if we have features that combine or that are shared by groups that are defined by their social features. Okay. So this would be a lect and this would be a lect. So, crucially, the lower bullet here, we can check for systematicity by looking for systematic correspondences between bundles of linguistic variables and then sociolinguistic parameters. That's the translation of the method that we learned from our 19th century specialists. And the underlying theoretical question to stay with the 19th century would be whether we have to adopt a totally non-neo-grammarian model like the one that was basically formulated by Schuchart in the 19th century. I want to come back to this historical analogy at the very end of the talk. So the case study here is a study on morphological markers of colloquial Belgian Dutch, which was studied in the thesis of one of our PhD students. And this includes quite a number of sociostylistic variables, then a number of linguistic variables. Then I'll say something about the method, and then we'll briefly see what the results are. So sociostylistic parameters are basically the same as in the previous study, because this was also based on the spoken Dutch corpus. So we have register, province, generation, not just age. That's it's so interesting. I want to say something about it. It's not relevant, but I want to say something. We used sociologically defined generations rather than just age groups. Sociologists have let's say, cultural, historical, or economical way of defining generations, like the baby boomers. Okay, that's a generation. I'm a proud member of the lost generation in sociological terms. And we thought it was more insightful to use that type of age classification than just 20s, 30s, 60s, and so on. Gender education level, occupation level. Then register components are already said something about that, public speech, etc., etc. Provinces, gender, and then generation, as you can see here, and occupational level. And the linguistic variables, that's a large collection of phenomena in the nominal and verbal morphology of Dutch. And I'm giving you just one example here. Diminutives in standard Dutch. So stoeltje, that's a small chair. Boompje, a small tree. If you look at colloquial Belgian Dutch, it's very typical. Then you have not stoeltje, but stoeleke, boompje, boomeke, and so on. So they're very, very distinct. The method then, and that's where the if you wish, the next step comes in. So instead of looking at just one variable, one external variable, geographical distribution, we now have to look at a large number of external variables at the same time, all the ones that we showed a moment ago. So how can we do that? Well, the method we used here was to use a correspondence analysis. So that gives you a plot where the clustering of either the external variables or the linguistic variables shows similarity in behavior between both groups. And that means that what we should expect is that if we have a clear lectal structure, so homogeneity, that would mean that a number of linguistic variables cluster together in the very close vicinity of one or more external lectal variables. So what I'm trying to do now, you understand that, is to give a counterpart, if you wish, of the Rienesch-Van type of approach. But in actual practice, you find no structuring of that type at all. So I'm showing you a number of graphs. This is the overall picture. So the things in red, if you can see that they are in red. Well, that's a pity. But in actual fact, so for instance, the characters, the single characters, those are the different register components. Okay. So those are the register components, and then, for instance, if you take in the red thing in the top left corner, WVL, that's one of the provinces, and that's a label for one of the provinces. But what you see in general is that there is some type of structure there, but it's not a clear structure where you have very close correspondences between linguistic features and lectal features. I can zoom in a little bit on specifics. So register, for instance, you see that so those are the single characters, the single letters. They're distributed all over the place. Here you have one that is an example of a very close correspondence, but in general it's not the case. Register, oh, this is in blue and green, this is a bit more clear. Register, what you can see is that so this is what we're doing here is to zoom in on the central part of the plot. And what you have, in fact, is the blue ones. So these are just the linguistic variables. The blue ones are the standard language ones. The green ones, if I'm not mistaken, are the colloquial ones. So there is some form of structure, but the structure is not in terms of clustering. The structure is in form of continuous dimensions. So we're zooming in even further here still with regard to register. And even further, let me go through that. Region is somewhat similar. Generation, again, there is some kind of structure. We would say that these are the younger people, these are to some extent the older generations, so there is a generational effect, but again, there's no clear separation of groups. Yeah, gender does not have effects. Educational level, again, it's not so clear. Professional level, some features clearly correlate, but not in the sense of bundles. So all in all, I would say that roughly all the lectal parameters reveal the same pattern. Lectal dimensions do play a role, as expected, but there's no Rienish fan effect, or at least there is a Rienish fan effect, in the sense that linguistic variables do not cluster into very discrete lects or data, or strata, sorry. Again, you could formulate a counter-argument. You could say, yes, but you've only looked at separate points for the lectal variables. What happens if we break down the lects by considering combinations of lectal dimensions? But that really doesn't improve the picture. So here, for instance, we actually need a pointer to. Let's see if this works. No, anyway, it's not so important. You can see the graph.f somewhere. That's a combination of the pragmatic generation and then the so here you have these are the young women basically, the youngest age group. So that's the combination of features of lectal features that we're looking at now. And again, there is some association there, but in general, you don't see such a very clear structure. The same, for instance, for the interaction of generation and then the boys and the men. It doesn't improve the overall picture very much. So, the results from this type of analysis And I think I should say there are probably other ways of showing the same type of non-homogeneity. I've now used the correspondence analysis because basically also because I like to have it in a graphical format, in a visual format, but you can do it in other ways. And the point I want to emphasize is that I believe that there is very thoroughgoing non-homogeneity, and you also see that in contemporary research, very recent research, where people start looking at individual differences more and more. That is the end point, if you wish, of the tendency towards homogeneity. So the entire picture turns out to be of the Schuchart type. Lectal dimensions play a distinct role, but the values that linguistic variables occupy on the lectal dimensions are ordered on a continuum rather than by categorical stratification. And second, if you turn the perspective round, then you can say that lects have prototype structure. They're not really clearly demarcated, but there are central elements of lects, and then they gradually shift into other lects, more or less like the High German area gradually shifts in the Low German area. Linguistic variables may be more or less characteristic of a language variety, and each variable may have its own position. And that, of course, is something that does not square very well with the traditional idea of a linguistic system. Because we do have this structuralist legacy of trying to bundle different features together in so-called systems. I have my doubts about that, as you can see. So let's round off. There are still a few more slides. This is not the last one. The corpus-based social turn in cognitive linguistics constitutes an opportunity to formally reconsider some deep-seated assumptions of mainstream 20th century linguistics. First, the homogeneity of linguistic systems. Second, the modularity of grammar. Specifically, a test for modularity may be operationalized in terms of interaction effects in regression analysis, and a test for homogeneity may be operationalized in terms of parallel behavior or absence of parallel behavior of lectal variables. And that's the eternal return question. Well, eternal, just covering 2 centuries or 200 years, but that's already a long time. So the evidence for non-modularity and heterogeneity, I think, suggests that 21st century linguistics is repeating a 19th century debate. Let's see how. What we had in the 19th century was a debate between a standard view and an oppositional view. And the debate happened precisely on the 2 levels that we've been considering. The external perspective, the relationship between languages, and the internal perspective, the constitution of the grammar. What were the positions? Well, the standard view on the external perspective is the family tree model, the model that also underlies the assumptions we had about High German and Low German, for instance. So that's, if you want to associate it with a name, that's Schleicher. That's family tree model presupposing internally homogeneous languages. And then, of course, the internal perspective, that's the neo-grammarian. The standard view is the neo-grammarian point of view, where you assume the exceptionlessness, die Ausnahmslosigkeit of sound change. And you could say that's a kind of rule-based approach. Okay? Things happen by rules, and the rules are laws. The oppositional view, already in the 19th century, is on the one hand the Schmidt-Wencker approach, which is sometimes referred to as a wave model of sound change, where you have lexical heterogeneity, you know, the different waves of the German sound change rolling over the Rhine area. And then, on the other hand, on the internal level, you have a Schuchart-type approach, as in his work über die Lautgesetze gegen die Junggrammatiker, against the neo-grammarians, where, in a sense, it's very difficult to find. It's sometimes identified by the quote or the aphorism that each word has its own history, also from a phonetic point of view. But I don't think, and that's a quote that's usually attributed to Schuchart, but I don't think it's by Schuchart himself. There's some difficulty about who actually is the origin of the quote. But anyway, that's the idea. Okay. Now, if we translate that into the 20th and 21st century, then of course in the 20th century we have a Saussurean idea of language as systems, internally homogeneous system. You don't have structure if you don't have the system. And Chomskyan approach from the internal perspective is of course grammar as a modular system, with core grammar as syntax, autonomous in the same way in which sound laws are autonomous. So there is a clear conceptual parallel between mainstream theories of 20th century linguistics, dominant theories of 20th century linguistics, and what we had in the 19th century. And then, of course, my claim is that what we see as the emerging 21st century point of view parallels the 19th century oppositional views, in the sense that you have the two things that I was arguing for in this talk. So on the one hand, the idea that language is inherently and thoroughly socially variable, and on the other hand, the idea that language is also radically non-modular. And if this is correct, then we are in fact returning to a 19th century position, and that's the long-term perspective which I would like to end. Thank you. Yeah, questions? Questions or pies?
Actually, yeah, I had a question. So, actually, I'm personally a psycholinguist who is in favor of what can be called like soft modular view. So, what I'm interested in, when you discuss the modular approaches to in psycholinguistics, you seem to assume that they kind of none of them presupposes any interaction between syntactic, semantic, and say contextual discourse-based information. While, as far as I can judge from from inside this field, the strict modular approach, where you really presuppose that there is no interaction, was popular in the 70s,
yeah.
maybe in the 80s, but actually since the 90s, it was clear from inside the field as well that it's not tenable. So as far as I can judge, what people try to do now is either like fully interactions, like say Merlin, McDonald, and so on, or if they want to stay modular, they more or less presuppose that, say when you parse a sentence, the syntax has some kind of a special role only in like offering possible parses of a sentence, while when you choose an interpretation, or when you choose an interpretation of a, say, homonymous to every source of information is taken into account immediately.
Yeah.
So, say experiments by John Trueswell and his team from the middle of the 90s show that you immediately take into account lexical information, context-based information, and so on and so forth. So, as far as I understand, if you see the interaction in the corpora, this is compatible with this soft modular approach that is advocated in psycholinguistics now. And as far as I can judge, nobody in psycholinguistics is that crazy to try to maintain these strict modular ideas that have been popular in the 70s and early 80s.
No, thank you. I think that of course, you know that literature much better than I do, but of course, my question would be, if I try to be my own devil's advocate, would be, so in the example you gave, for instance, say an initial syntactic parsing and then a more discourse pragmatic or whatever based selection of possibilities, that could in a certain sense still be interpreted as a sequential working of autonomous modules.
Modular approach is about.
Yeah. And what I tried to suggest was something that goes even one step further, because, I think in the type of modeling that you would use in psycholinguistics, that would take the form of backtracking.
No, I wouldn't say so. So as far as I can judge, the soft modular approach gives the only role that syntax has, like as something special, is offering possible parses.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you have a sentence like the horse raced past the barn fell, this famous garden path sentence that is being discussed since, I guess, the 70s, syntax tells you that raced can be either past tense verb or a passive participle, and this is what syntax knows and discourse doesn't quite know. But then, actually, what is chosen is immediately influenced by syntactic simplicity, but also discourse context, because, for example, if you have two horses, people tend to choose the passive participle because you need to restrict, which is the horse out of all possible alternatives.
But
and actually, you see full interaction from, I guess, the first, milliseconds.
Yes, precisely. But that, so in the way I try to describe it, the moment where the interactions start would also be quite important. It's also like with lexical decision things. At one point, and people seem to follow different paths at the same time in the processing, and the turns they take, so to speak, or the choices they make are at each step simultaneously determined by various factors. And that is, so I wonder to what extent that would still be a modular approach.
This is a very soft version.
Yeah, except for just saying there is a thing like, there is something that we call syntax and there is something that we call semantics. And that's, of course, if that is the minimal option of modularity, then we don't have a discussion, because that's to some extent, in a sense, just a terminological discussion.
Actually, if I'm not occupying the time and everybody else wanted to ask a question, as far as I understand, we still do have some discussion, because actually in neurolinguistics, there are as far as I can judge from 2008 and so on, there are people who argue that even when you parse, there are these kind of parallel models by, say, Matthias Śleszewski and Ingeborg Kessel-Śleszewski, and some other people who actually argue that even when you parse, you do your syntax and semantics. And this is fully non-modular.
No,
and there are some other people say Colin Phillips and his lab in Maryland, and they say that syntax gives you your options, and then the selection of options is immediately from the first millisecond influenced by all possible sources of information. So this is, I guess, would be the difference between soft modularity and fully interactive.
No, precisely, but I agree with that. I was just trying to say that what we should be careful about is not to reduce the question to just the terminological decision that we call certain things syntactic and other things semantics. That is such a minimal option that it's not relevant. But that's precisely not the debate that you referred to.
May I actually have a question on methods, but need to start rather philosophically, so to say, because for those linguists who were trained in the 20th century, and in this country it actually was a more prolonged tendency till the end of 90s maybe, when linguistics tried to be very much to be a hard science, so to say. And then it was immediately followed by a new trend of becoming a hard science because new methods like neurolinguistics and psycholinguistics were coming from that. So we actually almost missed this period that in the West was advocated by the more humanistic, so to say, approach. So that's it for the philosophy. So why I say this is a question, because fully following the as you say, the emerging 21st century view, which I believe we kind of could find even in some 20th century works by certain people. The question is, because I think that's what every serious person who advocates this approach will still have in mind. Are there methods with which we can deal with this messy? It's a messy subject of, variability, wave approach, non-modularity, with some less messy methods that we used to adore and actually which are imposed on us by our wish to be scientific. You mentioned, and I'm afraid if you are already saying it in your, telling about this in your lectures, because I couldn't attend your lectures for students. Besides these recurrences methods, when you look at the interconnection between the two or maybe even more factors working together, what else can? Because I think this is a very strong method. But is there anything else that we should know for that to be more hard in our approaches?
Anything else like?
Did I mispronounce or use the term recurrence method?
No. You mean in the first case study or in the?
Yes, I think it was in the first when you were talking about.
Yeah, well,
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
This is a regression analysis.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, regression analysis. Yes. So what else can we use for? Because as I said, it's a messy subject. You deal with various very soft parameters, variables, and you want to see how they interact. So
well, let me just say two things about that. One point is the general thing is, of course, that we are dealing with messy phenomena. I think that's correct. But that's, I guess, precisely why people are more and more turning to statistical modeling. Yeah? Because statistics is precisely also a way of trying to find structure in complicated data.
to get yourself shut from the messiness.
To find some structure and a structure that arises out of the data and that is not a priori imposed. That's a fairly important thing. The other question is, well, maybe there are 3 points. The second point is, of course, this is only one statistical method, and in the development of methodology, linguistic methodology these days, people are trying different types of statistical modeling and related approaches. So it's definitely the case that, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I can see, the methodology of statistical probabilistic corpus-based approach is not stabilized yet. That's definitely the case, and I think we will probably need a few more years before kind of standard set of methods emerges. And I'm talking about a set of methods because you will probably want to see which types of methods are specifically suited for specific problems. Like in this case, clearly a regression analysis is interesting because we were modeling the choice between two variables. And that's typically the thing that you can do with which is the regression analysis. And the third point, and that is something that's methodologically, of course, very important. It's not just the techniques that you use to find structure in the data that is important. It's very much also the way in which the relevant characteristics, the relevant features are chosen and operationalized. Because you can, in a case like this, with a simple, relatively simple feature like animacy, okay, the question was asked, was there a hypothesis? Yes, and the choice for animacy was to some extent driven by the hypothesis. I guess you would arrive at the same feature and could arrive at the same feature from other perspectives, but there was an initial choice to be made. But then of course, once you say animacy, okay, there are different ways of coding animacy. When you talk about groups of people or institutions, human institutions, are they just inanimate, or do you range them with the animates, or are they a third category of some sort? And if you have the inanimates, do you want to have just a binary opposition, or do you want to have a more intricate coding? So there is always a question, and then of course on top of that, that's not so difficult with animacy, but it's more difficult with other features. How exactly do we associate that information with the observations that we have in the corpus? Sometimes it gets more difficult to find the things that you need or to establish them in the corpus data. So there are lots and lots of methodological parameters that can vary. The statistical technique, the choice of input features, the operationalization of the input features, and perhaps even more. And that, of course, is one of the reasons. So to come back to the first point, that's one of the reasons why there is a lot of variation in usage-based methodologies at the moment, and why a search for the best methods should be on the agenda for the next decades, let's say, to keep ourselves going for a while.
If I may continue on this, do you think that this, because that would be a wonderful case looking for the input parameters as a result of statistical methods of research and clustering may potentially lead to the emergence of some of the parameters that we couldn't preview at the beginning. And for the society and sociolinguistic aspects of it developing in such a drastically fast fashion, partly because of new technologies, we may expect very much emergence of this. Can you preview such an instances of having not traditional parameters like, I don't know, animacy or gender or educational level that will have impact, but something like, I don't know what, belonging to certain network communities that will definitely influence the language, something that didn't exist before, and we will discover it through this analysis that will show us the clustering.
Yes, definitely, but I'm not.
New communities, so to say.
Yeah, definitely new communities, and of course, internet communities. In internet communication, you do have lots of communities that are, for instance, supranational. Yeah? The global communication among people has increased enormously, and those are, to a large extent, communities that are defined by common interests. I don't know, people talking about, to take a harmless example, people talking about photography, for instance.
Common language.
Yeah. But of course you have lots of weird political groups and so on. And those are communities with a different constitution than what we traditionally look at. And to come back to the distinction that I used between the external variables and the internal variables, this is an example of a new type of external lectal feature. But your corpus methodologies or the empirical research could also lead to new discoveries, in a sense, within the grammar on the structural level. That would, for instance, be the case if for instance, there are some standards for. No, let me come back to it's fictitious, but let me come back to the animacy example. I mentioned different ways of coding of animacy clients, from animate to inanimate, and you have different suggestions. If the empirical methods were to systematically test the different codings of animacy that exist, then after a number of trials, we might find out which, normally speaking, gives the best results. Or we might also find out that the type of animacy coding that we need is different in relation to different linguistic phenomena. And that would, of course, be also a form of cumulative effects. Maybe that's not as drastic as new communities, but it's a similar type of progress, let's say, or change. Yeah.